In 1971, a billboard appeared on the highway outside Seattle. It asked a simple question: will the last person leaving Seattle please turn out the lights? It wasn't a joke, it was desperation. Boeing, the company that had employed nearly 100,000 people in the Seattle area just 2 years earlier, had laid off more than 60,000 workers. The unemployment rate in Seattle hit 14%. Houses sat empty. Families packed up and left. And at the center of it all stood the largest building ever constructed by human beings. Half empty, hemorrhaging money, a monument to ambition that had gone terribly wrong. The Boeing Everett Factory. From the air, it looks impossible. A structure so vast that your eyes struggle to find the edges. By volume, nothing built before or since comes close. 98.3 acres of floor space, 472 million cubic feet of interior volume. When it was finished in 1967, you could fit the entire Disneyland park inside it with room left over. This building was designed to assemble the Boeing 747, the jumbo jet that would revolutionize air travel. But in the early years, from 1966 to 1971, this factory nearly destroyed the company that built it. Boeing bet everything on a single airplane, constructed the biggest building in the world to manufacture it, and then watched as orders dried up, cash evaporated, and the whole operation teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Thousands of workers lost everything, the regional economy collapsed, and this building, this monument to what seemed possible in the 1960s, sat as a reminder of how quickly confidence can turn to panic. My name is Jonathan Reed. I look at buildings that shaped history. Factories, plants, industrial spaces, the places where people showed up every day and built the world with their own hands. I'm not interested in conspiracy or speculation. I'm interested in what actually happened, what the physical evidence tells us, and what we can learn from structures that witnessed it all. And if you're interested in these spaces, the ones most people drive past without thinking about, you might want to follow along. This is the story of the Everett Factory. Not the sanitized version you'll find in corporate histories, but the real story. The early years, the desperate years, the years when the biggest building in the world became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when ambition outpaces reality. To understand why Boeing built this factory, you have to go back to 1965. Boeing was riding high. The 707, introduced in 1958, had transformed commercial aviation. It was the first successful American jetliner, and it dominated the skies. Airlines around the world were buying them as fast as Boeing could build them. The company was profitable, confident, and looking for the next big thing. In the early 1960s, the U.S. military approached Boeing about building a massive cargo plane for the Air Force, the C-5A Galaxy. It would be the largest aircraft ever built, capable of carrying tanks, helicopters, entire supply chains. Boeing wanted the contract badly. But in 1965, Lockheed won the bid. Boeing was left with designs, engineering studies, and a team of people who'd spent months thinking about how to build enormous airplanes. And instead of walking away, they made a decision that would define the company for the next decade. They decided to build a massive passenger jet anyway, not for the military, for commercial airlines. This was the 747. The logic seemed sound. Air travel was exploding in the 1960s. More people were flying than ever before. Airports were getting crowded. Airlines were running out of gates. The solution, Boeing believed, was to build a plane that could carry twice as many passengers as anything currently in service. Instead of flying more planes, you fly bigger planes.
Pan Am World Airways, Pan Am, was the dominant international carrier at the time, and its president, Juan Trippe, loved the idea. In April 1966, Pan Am signed a letter of intent to purchase 25 of these massive jets for $525 million. Other airlines followed. There was excitement, optimism, and a sense that this was the future. But here's the problem. The 747 didn't exist yet. Boeing had some designs on paper, but no prototype, no factory capable of building it, and no clear idea if the thing would even fly. And to build it, they would need a factory unlike anything that had ever been constructed. Boeing's existing facilities couldn't handle the 747. The plane was simply too large. The wingspan alone was 195 feet. The fuselage was 225 feet long. You couldn't assemble something that size in the buildings Boeing had in Seattle. The 707 production line was already at capacity, and even if it wasn't, the 747 wouldn't fit through the doors. So Boeing needed a new factory. And not just any factory, they needed the largest enclosed space ever built. In June 1966, Boeing selected a site, 780 acres of land in Everett, Washington, about 30 miles north of Seattle. It was mostly forest and pasture. Payne Field, a small county airport, was nearby. The land was relatively flat, close to rail lines, and accessible by highway. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical. Construction began almost immediately, and the scale of what they were attempting became clear very quickly. The main assembly building would cover 98.3 acres. To put that in perspective, that's more than 75 football fields under one roof. The building would be 1,025 feet long, 300 feet wide in some sections, and over 100 feet tall. The doors, the largest ever built at the time, would stand 82 feet high and weigh 700 tons each. This wasn't construction. This was civil engineering on a scale that bordered on absurd. Turner Construction Company managed the project. At the peak of construction, more than 2,000 workers were on site every day. Concrete was poured continuously. Steel beams, some weighing over 50 tons, were lifted into place by cranes that had to be specially designed for the job. The foundation alone required over 200,000 yards of concrete. And all of this was happening while Boeing was simultaneously designing the 747 itself. Think about that. They were building the factory before they'd finalized the plane. They were pouring the foundation for a structure designed to assemble an aircraft that existed mostly on blueprints and in the imaginations of engineers who weren't entirely sure it would work. The building was completed in less than 2 years. On May 1, 1967, the first section of the factory was ready. By any standard, it was an astonishing achievement. Fastest construction of a building this size in history. But speed came at a cost. The factory was expensive, very expensive. Estimates vary, but Boeing spent somewhere between $200 million and $300 million on the Everett facility, equivalent to well over $2 billion today. And that was just the building. It didn't include the tooling, the machinery, the production equipment, or the cost of actually developing the 747. Boeing was all in. They'd committed everything to this airplane and to this factory, and if it didn't work, there was no fallback plan. While the factory was being built, Boeing's engineers were trying to figure out how to actually build the 747. This wasn't just a bigger version of the 707, it was an entirely different kind of aircraft. The 747 would be a wide-body jet, meaning the fuselage was wide enough to accommodate 2 aisles. It would have an upper deck, the distinctive hump that became the plane's signature feature. It would carry between 350 and 500 passengers, depending on configuration. And it would be powered by 4 turbofan engines, each producing over 40,000 pounds of thrust. Nothing like it had ever been built. The engineering challenges were immense. The wings had to be strong enough to support a plane that could weigh up to 735,000 pounds at takeoff, but light enough to actually fly. The landing gear had to absorb the impact of landing a plane that heavy without collapsing. The hydraulic systems, electrical systems, fuel systems, all of it had to be designed from scratch. And Boeing was doing all of this under intense time pressure. They'd promised Pan Am that the first 747 would be delivered by December 1969. That gave them less than 3 years from the start of construction to build a plane that didn't exist, test it, certify it, and get it into service. It was madness, but it was also brilliant, in a reckless kind of way. By September 1968, the first 747 prototype was ready for rollout. The ceremony was held at the Everett Factory.
More than 10,000 people attended, including employees, journalists, airline executives, and dignitaries. It was a spectacle. The plane was enormous, dwarfing everything around it. People walked underneath the wings and stared up in disbelief. Boeing's chairman, William Allen, stood in front of the crowd and called the 747 a great weapon for peace. Pan Am's Juan Trippe said it would change the world. There was champagne, there were speeches, there was optimism. But the plane still hadn't flown. The first test flight took place on February 9, 1969. Test pilot Jack Waddell took the 747 up from Payne Field, flew it for about 75 minutes, and brought it back down. The plane handled well, no major problems. Boeing's engineers were cautiously optimistic. But optimism doesn't pay the bills. Here's what Boeing didn't advertise during the rollout ceremony. They were running out of money. Developing the 747 was staggeringly expensive. The program cost estimates kept climbing. By 1969, Boeing had spent over $1 billion on the 747, far more than initially projected. And they hadn't delivered a single plane yet. The company was financing this through a combination of customer deposits, bank loans, and their own cash reserves. But the deposits only covered a fraction of the costs. The loans had to be repaid, and the cash reserves were disappearing fast. In 1969, Boeing's total debt was around $1.2 billion. To put that in context, that was more than the company's annual revenue. They were leveraged to a degree that would be considered reckless by any standard. And then the orders stopped coming. In the late 1960s, the airline industry hit turbulence. The economy slowed, fuel prices started climbing. Airlines that had been enthusiastic about the 747 in 1966 were suddenly less certain in 1969. Some delayed their orders, others canceled outright. By 1970, Boeing had firm orders of about 150 aircraft. That sounds like a lot, but it wasn't nearly enough to cover the development costs and keep the production line running profitably. The company needed hundreds of 747s just to break even. And production wasn't going smoothly either. The Everett Factory, for all its size and sophistication, was a mess in the early years. The building was so large that communication was a nightmare. Workers on one side of the factory couldn't easily coordinate with workers on the other side. Parts didn't arrive on time, assembly sequences got out of order, mistakes were made, corrected, and made again. Boeing had never built a plane this complex. The 747 had 6 million parts. 6 million. Every rivet, every wire, every hydraulic line had to be installed correctly or the plane wouldn't fly. And in the rush to meet deadlines, quality suffered. Early 747s had problems. Cracks in the wings, electrical failures, engine issues, though those were mostly Pratt & Whitney's fault, not Boeing's. The FAA delayed certification multiple times. Airlines grew impatient. Pan Am finally took delivery of the first 747 in January 1970. The plane entered service on January 22, 1970. It was a milestone, but it didn't solve Boeing's financial crisis. In 1969, Boeing employed nearly 100,000 people in the Seattle area. By the end of 1971, that number had dropped to around 38,000. More than 60,000 jobs gone in 2 years. This wasn't downsizing, this was a collapse. The problem was simple. Boeing had overextended. They'd bet everything on the 747 and on a military contract for a supersonic transport, the SST, that was eventually canceled by Congress in 1971. When both programs ran into trouble simultaneously, the company had no cushion. The layoffs started in 1969 and accelerated in 1970. At first, it was a few hundred people here and there. Then it was thousands. Then it was entire shifts. Workers showed up one day and were told not to come back. The human cost was staggering. These weren't abstract numbers. These were machinists, engineers, assemblers, people who'd spent their entire careers at Boeing. Some had worked there for 20, 30 years. They had mortgages, families, lives built around the assumption that Boeing would always be there. And suddenly, it wasn't. The Everett Factory, which had employed over 25,000 workers at its peak, saw its workforce cut by more than half. Entire sections of the building sat dark and empty. Production slowed to a crawl. The few workers who remained described it as eerie. You'd walk through this massive building, the biggest in the world, and it felt like a ghost town. The impact on the local economy was catastrophic. Everett had grown rapidly in the late 1960s to accommodate Boeing's workforce. Housing development sprang up, schools expanded, businesses opened. All of it was built on the assumption that Boeing would keep growing. When the layoffs hit, the whole ecosystem collapsed. Houses went into foreclosure. Families couldn't pay their mortgages. Real estate values plummeted. Businesses that depended on Boeing workers, restaurants, stores, gas stations, started closing. Unemployment in the Seattle area hit 14%, the highest in the nation at the time. That billboard, "Will the last person leaving Seattle please turn out the lights?" wasn't just dark humor, it was how people actually felt. The city was dying. And at the center of it all was the Everett Factory, the largest building in the world, built for a plane that was supposed to save Boeing, now sitting half empty, a monument to ambition that had outpaced reality. So, what happened? How did Boeing go from confident optimism in 1966 to near bankruptcy in 1971? There's no single answer. It was a combination of factors, each one compounding the others. First, Boeing underestimated the cost of developing the 747 by a lot. Initial estimates put the program at around $400 million. The actual cost exceeded $1 billion. That's not a rounding error. That's a fundamental miscalculation of what it takes to design and build an entirely new kind of aircraft. Second, they overestimated demand. Boeing assumed airlines would keep ordering 747s at a steady pace. They didn't. The economic slowdown of the late 1960s and early 1970s made airlines cautious. Fuel prices were rising. Passenger growth wasn't keeping up with projections. Airlines that had been eager to buy 747s in 1966 were hesitant by 1970. Third, production problems. The Everett factory was enormous, but that size created its own challenges. Communication was difficult. Coordination was difficult. The assembly process was new, untested, and plagued with inefficiencies. Boeing was learning how to build the 747 while simultaneously trying to build it at scale. That's a recipe for mistakes. Fourth, the SST cancellation. Boeing had been counting on the supersonic transport program to provide revenue and keep engineers employed. When Congress killed the program in 1971, it pulled the rug from under the company. Thousands of engineers who'd been working on the SST suddenly had nothing to do. Boeing couldn't afford to keep them.
And fifth, debt. Boeing had borrowed heavily to finance the 747 program and the Everett factory. When sales didn't materialize as quickly as expected, they couldn't service the debt. The banks started getting nervous. Credit tightened. Boeing was caught in a vice. There were moments when it looked like the company might not survive. In 1971, Boeing CEO Thornton Wilson later admitted that they came within weeks of running out of cash. Weeks! If the banks had refused to extend more credit, if a few more airlines had canceled orders, Boeing would have collapsed. But it didn't collapse, and the reason it didn't is worth examining. Boeing survived for 3 reasons: luck, timing, and the 747 itself. The luck came in the form of a few key orders that arrived at critical moments. In 1970, Japan Airlines ordered additional 747s. Lufthansa placed an order. These weren't huge orders, but they were enough to keep the production line moving and convince the banks that Boeing wasn't dead yet. The timing came from the broader economy. By late 1971, the recession started easing. Airline traffic began recovering. Fuel prices stabilized. The panic that had gripped the industry in 1969 and 1970 started to subside. Airlines that had delayed orders started placing them again. And the 747 itself, despite all the problems, despite the delays and the cost overruns, it turned out to be exactly what Boeing had promised. It was reliable, it was efficient, it could carry more passengers farther than any other plane. And once airlines started operating it, they realized it was profitable. The The 747 changed air travel. It made international flights accessible to millions of people who'd never flown before. It opened up routes that hadn't been economically viable with smaller planes. And as the 1970s progressed, demand for the 747 grew. By 1973, Boeing had delivered over 100 aircraft. By 1976, over 200. The production line stabilized. The Everett Factory, which had been half empty in 1971, started filling up again. Workers were rehired. The economy in the Seattle area began recovering. But the scars remained. The workers who'd been laid off in 1970 and 1971 didn't forget. A lot of them never came back. They found jobs elsewhere, left the area, moved on with their lives. The trust between Boeing and its workforce, the sense that the company would take care of people who gave them their careers, that was broken. And the Everett Factory itself, for all its size and capability, would always be a reminder of how close Boeing had come to disaster. It was built in a moment of supreme confidence, and within a few years, it became a symbol of hubris. The Everett Factory is still there, still the largest building in the world by volume, still assembling aircraft. Today, it produces the 747, though production is winding down, the 767, the 777, and the 787 Dreamliner. The workforce fluctuates, but it's typically between 30,000 and 35,000 people. Tours are available to the public, and about 100,000 people visit every year. The building has been expanded multiple times since 1967. Additional bays were added to accommodate different aircraft types. The total footprint now over 4 million square feet. It's even bigger than it was in the early years. But if you look closely, you can still see traces of what happened in those first few years. The original sections of the building, the parts that were completed in 1967, they're still there. The massive doors, the high ceilings, the enormous open spaces designed for an aircraft that nearly destroyed the company that built it. And if you talk to people who worked there in the early 1970s, the ones who are still around, they remember. They remember the layoffs, the panic, the feeling that everything they'd built was collapsing. Some of them are bitter. Some have made peace with it, but none of them have forgotten. The Everett Factory is often presented as a triumph, the largest building in the world, home to the iconic 747, a testament to American engineering and ambition. And in some ways, that's true.
But it's also a reminder of the cost of that ambition, of what happens when confidence outpaces caution, of how quickly things can fall apart when you bet everything on a single vision. I think about this building a lot. I've spent time walking around the perimeter, looking at the structure, trying to understand what it represents, and I keep coming back to the same question. What does it mean to build something this large, this ambitious, and then watch it nearly fail? The Everett Factory was built in a moment of extraordinary optimism. The 1960s, the space race, the jet age, a belief that technology could solve any problem, that bigger was always better, that the future was limitless. And that optimism wasn't entirely misplaced. The 747 did change the world. It did make air travel accessible. It did prove that you could build a plane that size and make it work. But the cost was real. 60,000 jobs lost, families displaced, a regional economy that took years to recover, and a company that came within weeks of bankruptcy. Was it worth it? I don't know. I'm not sure anyone can answer that definitively. For the people who lost their jobs in 1970, probably not. For the passengers who've flown on 747s over the past 50 years, maybe yes. For Boeing, which survived and eventually thrived, the answer is complicated. What I do know is that the Everett Factory stands as a testament to both the possibilities and the dangers of industrial ambition. It's a building that represents what we can achieve when we push the limits of engineering and imagination. But it's also a reminder that those achievements come with risk, with sacrifice, with human cost. And I think that's worth remembering. If you're interested in these stories, the ones that don't always make it into the official histories, you might want to stay in touch. I look at buildings like this, the ones that witnessed history, and I try to understand what they tell us about who we were and what we believed. There's a photograph I've seen from 1971. It shows the interior of the Everett Factory, the main assembly bay, mostly empty, a few 747s in various stages of completion, work lights hanging from the ceiling, and in the background, just darkness, huge sections of the building sitting idle. What strikes me about that photograph is the emptiness. This building was designed to be full, to be humming with activity, thousands of workers moving through it every day. And in that moment, in 1971, it was a void. I wonder what it felt like to be in that space, to walk through the biggest building in the world and hear your footsteps echo, to see all that potential, all that capability, and know that it wasn't being used. The Everett Factory survived. Boeing survived. The 747 became one of the most successful aircraft ever built. But the early years, those dark years from 1969 to 1971, they're part of the story too. And maybe that's the real lesson, that the buildings we construct, the monuments to our ambition, they don't just reflect our successes, they also carry the weight of our failures, our miscalculations, our moments of doubt. The Everett Factory is still the largest building in the world. It's still producing aircraft. It's still standing. But it's also still carrying the memory of what almost was, of the thousands of people who lost their jobs, of the families who left Seattle, of the moment when the biggest building in the world sat half empty, and no one knew if it would ever be full again. I think about that sometimes when I look at buildings like this. What they remember, what they've witnessed, what they still have to tell us if we're willing to listen.